And this is the first printed edition of the Quran that really is mass produced. You'll get some later when we get to the 19th century coming out of British India, and then finally the Ottoman Empire. But the earliest attempt at this is Russia.
Muslims have been part of Russia since 1552, when the state of Kazan was conquered by Tsar Ivan IV. As Russia grew to become an imperial power, its territories expanded far and wide, absorbing regions where Islam had been established as early as the 7th century. Dr Danielle Ross teaches Islamic and Russian history at Utah State University. She tells us the story of how Islam came to be Russia's largest religion after Orthodox Christianity.
So when we think about the borders of Russia today, the Caucasus are encountering Islam and becoming Muslim areas as early as the 700s and the 800s AD. And to put that into context, Kievan Rus, so kind of the first kind of Rus proto-Russian state, converts to Orthodox Christianity in about 988. So Islam is actually on the territory of what we now know as Russia before Orthodox Christianity is.
Welcome to Muslim Footprints, a deep dive into Muslim civilizations through the ages, accompanied by some of the best experts in their field. This episode is called The Story of Islam in Russia.
So, Danielle, can you give us some context about where in Europe Muslims were present as the Europe we know today, or we think about today, was being created?
So, if we go back to the early modern period, like the 1400s, 1500s, beginning of the early modern period, there's a lot of enclaves and Muslims around different parts of Europe. There are Muslims in Portugal, in Spain, in Sicily. There are also Muslims further east in what we now know as Russia. And as we move through from the 1400s to the 1600s, in places like Portugal and Spain and Sicily, those Muslim populations disappear. They were either expelled by the Christian monarchies, or they're converted and assimilated into the growing kind of European Christian states. In Russia, this doesn't happen. Russia takes a very different set of policies toward its Muslims, and so the Muslim populations that are there in the Middle Ages and the early modern period remain there as Europe is becoming modern in the 18th, 19th, and 20th centuries.
I mean, I'm asking you this because, it's kind of assumed that Muslims are new to Europe. But like you said, they've been there for centuries. And then if we look at the 19th century, do we have kind of numbers of how many Muslims were there? So it's mainly in two pockets, right? It's the Ottoman Empire and it's Russia.
It's very difficult to get figures for Muslims just in European Russia, because then you have to define where European Russia is. According to, I think by the census of 1897, you have about 20 million Muslims or so in the Russian Empire. So by the end of the 19th century. But that includes also Muslims in Central Asia, as well as in the Caucasus and in the Volga River Valley and Crimea.
Right, now let's go back to the start. So Russia had several waves of Muslims that came under its imperial umbrella from the 1500s onwards. Can you set the scene for us? What was Russia like in the 1500s?
Well, to understand how Islam is in Russia, you have to go back much further.
Okay.
Is that if you go to the Caucasus are not that far from what is then the Roman Empire and the Sassanid Empire in the 600s, 700s, 800s. So as Islam is expanding out of the Arabian Peninsula across Central Asia and the Middle East, it's also moving north into the Caucasus. So when we think about the borders of Russia today, the Caucasus are encountering Islam and becoming Muslim areas as early as the 700s and the 800s AD. As far as the Volga River Valley, the Khanate of Bulgar along the Volga River converts to Islam about 922. And to put that into context, Kievan Rus, so kind of the first kind of Rus, proto-Russian state, converts to Orthodox Christianity in about 988. So Islam is actually on the territory of what we now know as Russia before Orthodox Christianity is. Just as a side note as well, you have lots of trading going on through the 900s, 1000s. So we even know through archaeological records, we have Vikings who are being buried with jewelry, with clothing that have Allah and have other sort of Islamic inscriptions on them. We don't know that these Vikings had converted to Islam, but we know they must be coming in contact with Islamic culture. And a lot of that, part of that is through the trade that is coming up and down the Volga River in the 800s, 900s, 1000s. So that's kind of the long history.
Okay, and then what happens between then and the 1500s?
So in Russia proper, you have a lot of history. In the 1200s, you have the Mongol conquests. The Mongols take over a large part of what is now Siberia, central Russia. The westernmost part of Russia is not technically part of the Mongol Empire. It's sort of a set of vassal states to the Mongol Empire. And Russia, those lands, we'll call them Russia because they're not really Russia at that point, are under Mongol rule through the end of the 1300s, beginning of the 1400s. After the Black Death in the mid-1300s, a lot of things start to break apart politically in the Mongol Empire, and also the parts of the empire that are, what we call the Golden Horde, that region, and the Russian appanage states begin to also sort of break off, become their own states. One of those, and again, not yet Russia. We're not talking about Russia yet. The state that we want to follow, it's going to become Russia, is Muscovy, or Moscow, Moskva. They emerge by the 1400s as one of the new powerful successors to the Mongol Empire, in sort of on that kind of between Europe and what had been the Golden Horde. They're expanding through the 1400s and the 1500s and slowly gobbling up all those other little pieces that had been under the rule of the Golden Horde. And finally,
which is the Mongols.
Which were the Mongols. And finally, in 1552, under Ivan IV, or Ivan the Terrible, as he's often known in the US and Europe, Moscow or Muscovy conquers the Khanate of Kazan, which had been one of the other successor states of the Mongols in that region. The Khanate of Kazan it's ruled by Muslims. A large part of its population is Muslim. And this is considered a huge moment for Russia for two reasons. One, this is where we stop talking about Moscow and Muscovy, and we start talking about Russia. And so it's seen as the beginning of Russia's imperial expansion, becoming an empire. It's also the moment at which Russia suddenly gains a huge sort of territory that is mostly Muslim. There have been Muslims in Russia, in Moscow before this, that have been working as translators and mercenaries and soldiers, but they're just individuals. Whereas the Conquest of Kazan is the first time where Russia is conquering another territory that was Muslim. I guess I need to add just kind of a side note is the Mongols are not Muslim when they conquer Russia. The group of Mongols that happened to conquer all of that territory in the north and found the Golden Horde.
In the 1200s.
In the 1200s. In the 1300s, they convert to Islam. And so that's a second wave of Islam that is coming in on top of the Islam that you already have in places like the Volga River Valley and the North Caucasus. So you have those sort of two layers of Islam in there as well going on, is the pre-Mongol layer that's coming from the trade and the Arab conquests, and then the Mongol conversion in the 1300s. Now in 1552, Russia comes in, swallows up all of that territory, will eventually go on to conquer Siberia, which is also another kind of Muslim Khanate, and the Khanate of Astrakhan as well, which is at the very mouth of the Volga River in the south, which all of those are majority Muslim areas. So that's when Russia now becomes a ruler of a large Muslim population.
Okay, and so you've got Kazan, you've got Astrakhan, Siberia. Mm-hmm. You've got Kasim and also the Bashkirs of the Urals.
Yes,
did that all happen roughly around the same time?
That all happens about the same time.
Got it. So how did they go about? So Kazan is the first one. Mm-hmm. And so that was conquered in 1552. What is their approach to these territories?
What we can tell from the documents that we have left are we have two things going on. On the one side, Russia is trying at various points to establish its credentials as an Orthodox Christian state. So one side of the conquest is sending in missionaries, beginning to found monasteries in this territory to bring people to the Word of God, i.e., Orthodox Christianity. At the same time, that's a lot of people, right? And they have to be integrated somehow. So you have sort of two parallel things going on. You have the missionizing, but then you also have a lot of places where it's like, well, we know you're Muslim, but we need more soldiers to like staff this fort, so here you go. And there's a degree of trying to find sort of some mode of coexistence or way of co-opting the locals into doing all this different work that needs to be done to run a state. Because Russia simply doesn't have enough people to like import entire staffs out there to, to farm, to defend the area, to repair roads, all those things. So even though you have missionary work going on, especially aimed at the upper classes to try to get them to convert, they don't really care what the peasants are doing most of the time.
I suppose the elite can influence.
I think that's the idea, is that, the elite will sort of convert and then the peasants will follow them, and that doesn't really happen. A lot of the elite convert and then they gradually kind of disappear into the Russian nobility. So you get Russian nobility that have Tatar or Muslim looking last names, but by the 19th century, like they wouldn't know that they wouldn't identify with being Muslim in any way or being Tatar. And then you have kind of the townspeople and the peasants and the people lower down that for the most part are left, most of the time are left to do whatever they're doing in terms of their religion. They might be convinced, say, yeah, you're in debt. Convert to Orthodox Christianity will like get you out of debt, right? Or you've committed a crime, you need to get out of that, convert to Orthodox Christianity. So there's little like incentives to convert. But by and large, Islam is not persecuted in the way that it is in, say, Spain, once after the Reconquista, where you have all sorts of really specific anti-Muslim and anti-Jewish laws. You don't have this in 1552. Mostly average people continue living their lives.
Very interesting. And were these populations the same? So was Kazan similar to Bashkiria?
So the Bashkirs would be largely nomadic herdsmen. That means that they had sheep, cattle, horses, and then they would move seasonally between a summer and a winter pasture. Most of the people in the Volga River Valley who were Muslim would have been peasants. And in some cases, what we would call forest people, right? Is they're kind of living on the edges of the woods. They are also foraging and hunting in the forest, and they may also be farming at the same time. They would have spoken languages that would have been similar and probably mutually intelligible, but they had very different life ways. There's also a lot we simply don't know about this period because we don't have a lot of sources. If you could get in a time machine and go back, you would probably find that from one village to another, things might be quite different. Cultures would be very local, dialects would be very local. Whereas in the 19th century with the trains and steamships and people are moving around and you have the rise of nations and sort of the homogenization of some of these cultures that you wouldn't have had in the 15 and 1600s.
And so when you compare the nomads to Kazan, Kazan was a city.
Yes, Kazan is a trade city. But it's also a city in the sense of steppe cities. So the way that steppe politics worked is that it was, and this is a weird thing to think because we're all sedentary, elite people traveled, right? If you were truly a rich person, you could afford to like move with your livestock through the year. If you were a poor person, you didn't have any livestock, so you had to like stay where you were. So when we talk about cities in the steppe, a city was a space where if you were like rich and powerful, you owned a city, like you were at the top of your game. But also you might come into the city seasonally and then be out with your livestock part of the year. And then you have different dynasties that are sort of fighting for control of Kazan that are all nomadic, and so they'll throw each other out. And so you have a city proper with like merchants and townsmen and everything you think of as a city, and then this nomadic elite that will come in sort of as it's convenient for them. And they're fighting with other kind of other groups of nomads to control that same city. And this happens in Kazan. This is one reason why Moscow is able to intervene, because you have this conflict over exactly which group is control the city. But I just kind of want to emphasize it's a little bit different. It is a city, but it's not quite what we imagine, I think, when we think of a European city like London or Paris.
So essentially, these populations were integrated into Russia.
Yes. And integrated slowly at first because of the sheer distances. You wouldn't have seen, if you were a peasant in the Volga in the 1600s, you wouldn't have seen a lot of Russian officials around. You might have seen a missionary or not. Russian peasants come to settle in some places, but not others. So it's a fairly slow integration in a lot of ways.
And was that the time of Catherine the Great?
This is a bit before.
Okay.
So we haven't even gotten to Peter the Great yet, 1600s.
Right. So the Muslim population was surrounded by and often intermixed with a larger Russian population.
Increasingly, yes.
How do you differentiate between them?
You could have told, as in other parts of the early modern world, your clothing. That's where you would start. How are people dressing? Christians would dress differently from Muslims. We also have sort of pagans or animists in this region. Each of those groups would dress differently. You could tell often by language. Usually Russians, their first language would be Russian. Most of the Muslims would be speaking Tatar or Bashkir. So if you couldn't tell by their clothing, assume someone opened their mouth, you could tell who they were. We often have people that spoke multiple languages. What's kind of interesting in this region is through the era of Catherine the Great, so this is already into the late 1700s. The lingua franca, or the commonly spoken language in this area, was not Russian, it was Tatar.
Okay, what is Tatar?
So Tatar is a Turkic language. It is in the same big language family as Turkish, but it's from a different branch. And this is the language that would have been spoken before the Russians conquered Kazan in 1552. Bulgar is also a Turkic language, but it's, if we go back to the 900s, 1000s, but it's not a direct ancestor of Tatar. So Russian is a Slavic language. Tatar is a Turkic language. So they're pretty much, I would compare this to, if you're speaking French and Arabic, right? French and Arabic aren't that close. And that's the distance between those languages. In the same region, you have also Maris and Udmurts who were speaking Finno-Ugric languages, so languages related to Finnish. So there's a lot of languages going on. There's a lot of different religious practices going on in this area.
There's Arabic and Persian?
Arabic and Persian were the languages of the learned. So if you wanted to become a legal scholar or a poet, you would learn to read and write in Arabic. And of course, the Quran is in Arabic. So if you wanted to read that, you had to learn Arabic. Persian is the language that ties this area into the greater Muslim world. So if you wanted to go study in Bukhara, which, until the end of the 19th century for Tatars is like going to Harvard or going to Oxford, you had to learn Persian. Persian could take you to Kabul. A lot of people studied there. Merchants from this area went as far south as India. And this is in the Mughal period. And so they could find people who spoke Persian down there. So Persian was the way you kind of like got out of your district to go somewhere else to travel. It would have been like learning English today.
Fascinating. The next wave after the Kazans, Astrakhans, Siberia, Bashkiria was the Caucasus.
Yes.
Right.
Oh, we've skipped one little point there, which is Catherine. You brought her up earlier.
Let's talk about Catherine then.
So what you do have is in the 1500s, early 1600s, is we're kind of trying to do something with Kazan and we're not sure what. We're trying to integrate it into the empire. By the mid to late 1600s, increasingly you do have anti-Muslim statutes that are coming out. We have to be very cautious in how we interpret them, because a lot of them are directed toward the Muslims of this town or the Muslims of that district. But they start limiting the building of mosques. We have a law in the mid-1600s that says if you are caught as a Muslim missionary proselytizing to Christians, you will be burned. I don't know that we have a lot of evidence that that law was ever carried out, but it is on the books. And so there's if not as much pressure as in a place like Spain, there still is growing pressure on the Muslim populations under Russian rule in the late 1600s to the mid 1700s.
What caused that change?
Um, we don't know. I mean, we don't know for sure. One theory is that Russia goes through, again, these periods of really trying to emphasize its kind of orthodox credentials. And this is one of those moments of, we are an orthodox state. How can we have all these non-orthodox people walking around in our orthodox Christian state? Convert them. At the same time, by the mid 1600s, late 1600s, Russia is trying to centralize its government. And we talk about Peter the Great as sort of the great kind of reformer and centralizer of Russia, but this is happening under his father's reign as well. And so maybe we're not looking at just religious policy, but also at centralizing, trying to take all these weird little provinces that each have their own rules, bring them together into a more kind of centralized, organized system. And maybe the conversion is part of that.
Can you, I know population numbers are hard, but can you give us a sense of the size of the territory?
By now we're talking about, by the end of the 1600s, pretty much most of what we would think of as modern Russia.
Okay.
So that whole territory, this is thousands of miles. And since everything when we talk about Russia, it's always talking about getting something from one place to another, hundreds or thousands of miles away. So Catherine the Great, jumping ahead back to Catherine. By the mid-1700s, there have been a number of uprisings and revolts in the Urals with the Bashkirs and in the Volga River Valley, including but not limited to Tatars. We have Cossacks involved in this as well. Again, part of it is this systemization, centralization that's going on. Higher taxes, more rules about how you have to do things, and listen to the government in ways that you didn't have to before. And then, Catherine comes along. And Catherine is all about the Enlightenment and tolerance and all religions sort of moment. And so she says that, well, Christianity is still better, but Islam is part of that Abrahamic tradition, and religions can uplift people and organize people, and I'm looking for ways to sort of uplift my subjects and civilize my subjects. So let's think about tolerance, right? And we can tolerate Islam, and maybe we can even use it to start trying to get those Kazakhs down in the steppe and those people in the Caucasus that we'll come back to feel better about the Russian state. And a really interesting moment is the first Quran that is mass printed in the world, right? This isn't counting kind of these early Italian experiments. There's some earlier medieval, early modern experiments in this. But the first one that is printed, mass printed in Europe, but also generally because there's not in the world, and involving really bringing Muslim scholars into comment on, like, are we getting this right? How do we do the calligraphy? All of this happens in Russia under the reign of Catherine the Great in the very late 1700s, about 1790s. 1780s,
so mass
1790s.
printing was existing then?
Yes, it's in Europe. Again, Enlightenment, Catherine, and before that, Peter's tried to bring printing in. Catherine wants to bring more printing into Russia. And so they're starting these kind of state publishers and trying to get other private citizens to start publishing, but under the eye of the state, because the Russian state doesn't want you to print stuff it doesn't like. But part of that is that, hey, we can use this new technology to print Qurans. And then we can go give free Qurans to the Kazakhs. And they can say, Russia's giving us free Qurans. They must be really nice, and we want to be part of their state. And Caucasus as well. So this is a diplomatic moment. And Tatars from the Volga are brought in, some Tatar legal scholars, to actually help with the typesetting and the calligraphy style, because I have to make typeface in Arabic script because I don't have that. And also kind of for, trying to get it correct. And there are some errors that end up being in it, but it's not bad for the time. And this is the first printed edition of the Quran that really is mass produced. You'll get some later when we get to the 19th century coming out of British India, and then finally the Ottoman Empire. But the earliest attempt at this is Russia. It happens just at the end of Catherine's reign. Then her son Paul comes in and is like, I'm totally not in favor of this. And then the project kind of really gets going right at the beginning of the 19th century, and they'll continue printing Qurans through the rest of the 19th century. And these will we find these as far south as India.
Printed in Russia?
Yeah. And it's sometimes called the Kazan Quran.
Oh, really?
And so this is part of Catherine's, like, we're going to be tolerant and find ways to use Islam to expand my empire, and also to increase my subjects' loyalty to me. So part of this is part of Catherine's policy as well as, so let's say, Edict of Toleration, we now tolerate religions, then the founding of the Orenburg Spiritual Assembly, which is
Yeah, now what is this?
So you have, under Islamic law, if you have a problem, you need to resolve it, you go to an Islamic legal specialist, and they give you a legal opinion. And at this point, this has been happening in the Volga at a local level. Catherine says, well, and not just Catherine, some people working below her locally, like, we could actually create an institution for this. And broadly, they're looking maybe at the Ottoman Empire and how the Ottoman Empire handles Islamic law. They're also looking at the structure of the Orthodox Church, because the Orthodox Church has kind of, a rigid structure with somebody at the top of it. I think it bothers Catherine that Islam doesn't really have that structure, because how do you, communicate with the Muslim community when you're like, who's in charge?
But there's not a single Muslim community, right? They're all...
No. But even in the Volga, if you take the one in the Volga, there's not one person in charge of that community. You have a number of different prominent legal scholars. Some of them are friends. Some of them hate each other. So who do you talk to? And the Spiritual Assembly provides an answer to that question. They appoint one legal scholar, call him the Mufti, that's his title. Uh-huh. And he will now be the point person between the Russian government and all of the Muslim scholars out in the Volga River basin.
Which isn't all the Muslims.
Which is not all the Muslims.
No.
But as of yet, the Kazakhs are they're just being brought in through the 18th century, so they're sort of new to the block. Russia, at the time of Catherine, has not yet really gotten hold of the Caucasus. That's sort of in transition. So their big Muslim populations are going to be in Crimea. And they'll kind of try to set up some institutions for Crimea and try to adapt institutions that are already in the Crimean Khanate after they annex it, and then in the Volga basin. And there's also some crosstalk and personnel going back and forth between Crimea and the Volga, in terms of what are we doing with these Muslims? What are we doing with those Muslims? And ultimately, they'll create the Orenburg Spiritual Assembly just for the Muslims of the Volga, called the Volga-Ural region. That's the Volga River Valley and the Ural Mountains. And this is where Russian and Islam gets complicated, because there's not a Russian policy on Islam. There's a different Russian policy on Islam for every population that comes under Russian rule. So one for Crimea, a different for the Volga Basin, a different one for Central Asia, for the North Caucasus, for the South Caucasus. But the Orenburg Spiritual Assembly is considered that first moment when the Russian government starts creating governmental institutions for its Muslims.
Got it. If we just go back a bit to these different communities, how can we describe this variety?
So Russia, and to some extent, has it a little easier than one might expect.
Okay.
The kind of Turkic-speaking Muslim world, which runs roughly from the middle Volga River Valley down to almost to India, but not quite, down into Central Asia. It's Turco-Persian. So you have the same language. Most of them are they're Sunni Muslims. Most of them belong to the Hanafi madhab, or legal school. Most of them are Naqshbandi. Sufism is having a moment. So most of them are Naqshbandi, if they're legal scholars, or if they're artists, or if they're intellectuals. And so this is another way people can sort of move around as you come from this particular part of this world that spans several empires, but then you're Naqshbandi. It's like you sort of know the secret handshake, right? You may have studied with the same sheikh who these people down in Bukhara have studied with. And so that's a point where you can find sort of common ground. And also you all kind of studied, you're all Hanafi, you all study the same legal precedents, the same legal processes. Then we get to the Caucasus.
Right.
So the North Caucasus, lots and lots of different peoples, lots of different languages.
So Russia annexes the Caucasus in the 1700s.
In the late 1700s, and then the actual kind of integration of the Caucasus is going to be a series of wars that will go through a large part of the first half of the 19th century.
And these are Dagestan, Chechnya, Georgia and
No,
Azerbaijan?
Georgia is really Christian.
Yeah,
So they're
okay.
kind of, Georgians are sort of in a different spot there. But when you talk about the Caucasus Wars, we're talking about Chechnya, Dagestan, Ingushetia, that area. And again, like lots of different ethnic groups going on, mostly Shafi. Some Hanafi legal school down there. More later, after they get integrated into the Russian Empire, a lot of them the leaders get exiled to the Volga Basin and start talking to the Muslim legal scholars over there who are all Hanafi, and then bring the Hanafi scholarship back.
Okay.
But they're more Shafi in the Volga, in the North Caucasus, but they're Sunni Muslims. Then you get to the South Caucasus, Azerbaijan, who are Shia Muslims.
All right.
Yeah. And they are always going to be, I hate to put it this way, but the fat kid at the birthday party when we get to like Muslim movements in Russia, because it's like all of us are Sunnis and then those people over there. So that's another sort of element is if you're doing Azerbaijan or the area that becomes Azerbaijan, they're Turkic speaking, but they are, again, it's Shiism. So there's a different set of practices and legal school scholarship and everything else going on in that particular place.
Does it all come under Russia?
Yes.
Okay. And now the way that Russia manages this relationship with the Caucasus is different to this Catherine the Great toleration.
Yes. And well before Catherine the Great, Moscow seems to have gotten, later Petersburg, get very good at sort of co-opting Muslims in the Volga Basin to go out and do some of their dirty work for them. So, go out and promote Russian rule, work as interpreters, work as guides, work as camel drivers, right? All of these different jobs to help Russians expand their empire into the steppe and ultimately into Central Asia. In the Caucasus, very different situation.
Why is that? Is it because it looks different?
They don't really want to be part of the Russian state. We'll put it that way. The North Caucasus is between the Ottoman Empire, Iran, and Russia. Culturally, they're much more oriented toward the Ottoman Empire and Iran than they are toward Russia. They don't want to be under Christian rule. And you have resistance to the Russians trying to integrate the North Caucasus once they have annexed them.
Are these mountainous regions?
This is a very mountainous area. And so that's another thing that makes resistance easier, at least in a way, because it's very hard to fight people in this terrain. Whereas if you're in the Volga River Basin, it's flat. But also, nobody asked if these people wanted to be annexed. It's just like, hi, we're here, we're Russia, we're now running your state. There's a lot of local conflicts inside of those societies about kind of who's aligned themselves with the newly arrived Russians, who's benefiting and who's not. But the short version of the story is that by the 18 teens, you begin to get a series of wars in the North Caucasus that will go on until 1864.
And there weren't wars before?
No.
Those previous groups of Muslims?
There were uprisings from time to time, but not this sort of constant state of war that we see in the North Caucasus. But it's a different moment, right? This is the 19th century. This is when Britain is, taking over India. This is when, the French are really building out their empire eventually, into Africa and Asia, right? This is when the United States is spreading west across the continent. So it's a very different colonial moment. And both, I would argue that certainly the Russians are aware of this moment because they're comparing themselves to the British. But even colonial and potentially colonizable people are becoming increasingly aware of this, right? And so there's a lot of fierce resistance in the North Caucasus to becoming part of the Russian Empire.
Got it.
And if anybody's read Tolstoy or Pushkin or Lermontov, almost all of these major writers, Russian writers, cut their teeth in the Caucasus. At some point, they are deployed as officers into the Caucasus Wars, which is kind of an interesting thing to consider as well when you read Russian literature, is that the whole time, there's this war going on. And a lot of the people writing about affairs back in Petersburg are also serving at some point in the Caucasus.
Can you give us some background about Islam in the Caucasus?
not my area of specialization, but just very briefly, as I said, Islam starts to come into that area as part of the original Islamic conquests and expansion.
So that was the oldest.
And that's one of the oldest sort of Muslim spaces before Russia conquers Central Asia.
Yeah, okay.
Right. Then that's because Bukhara and those areas also have a very long history in the Islamic world. But before that, the Caucasus would have been one of the kind of spaces they conquered where Islam had really been established the longest. But again, and there's different moments in there. We think probably in the 1600s, you have a little bit more syncretism going on. Then you're going to have a series of sort of reformist movements going through the 1700s and the 1800s. Again, that I'm not a specialist on, but Islam itself, right? And how Islam is practiced and how Islamic law is practiced. All of this is being disputed in the Caucasus before and during the time that the Russians are trying to come in and conquer the area as well. So Islam is kind of developing and changing. But when we look at the Caucasus today and we think about, all of we have the wars in the early 2000s, this is not like new. The Caucasus didn't really want to be brought into the empire, and it's been on and off wars since then. After 1864, the wars end, but the Caucasus are periodically under martial law all the way down to the revolution in 1917.
I have some interesting examples about the way that Islam was practiced, and also you had rulers kind of going to pray at the mosques.
Mm-hmm.
Locally, there was this. I mean, as early as the kind of 1100s, you had kind of the Christian king of Georgia praying at a Tbilisi mosque every week.
Yeah.
I suppose that was.
And that's more part of that medieval period, right? And living in a space where you realize there's lots of different people. And when you get to the Volga Basin in the 1700s, you do have people that will also, officials that will sometimes come out to Kazan and will visit once there is a mosque there. Because another thing Catherine does is funds the construction of a mosque in Kazan in the late 1700s.
Oh, because there wasn't one?
Most of them had been gone, in the city. And so they're either destroyed after the conquest or they're kind of not repaired and eventually taken down. So she actually finances the construction of a mosque. And it's the only Baroque mosque, I think, in the world, because it kind of gets these European architects involved with it. But so you would have Russian officials go out to visit these sorts of mosques later as well. In the mosques, at the same time, you have the imams get up to give the khutbah or the sermon, and they have sermons about how you're supposed to support the Tsar, and we pray for the Tsar. This is a part of being a Muslim in Russia. Once your area is conquered, it's you get up and you say your prayer for the Tsar during Friday prayer. So,
and if there were no mosques, where were they praying?
In the villages, there are mosques.
Okay.
Otherwise, you would be praying at home, which people did. But you have that period where you're not, in the 1600s, where they outlawed the building of more mosques. They stopped funding the repair of mosques. And so from the mid-1600s to kind of the late 1700s, you don't have a lot of new mosque construction going on. Then starting in the late 1700s, it takes off. Partially because, you can do it, it's legal, but also there's all sorts of trade going on. And there's more and more money pouring into towns like Kazan. So you have a lot of private citizens that will put up money to build mosques. And we see this also in the Caucasus. We see it a little bit later in the Kazakh steppe by the mid-1800s. More and more mosque building happening. So there's this kind of explosion of mosque building in Russia from starting with Catherine and going all the way down to the revolution. And it's accelerating. At some point, you have Russian officials in certain parts of the empire step in and they're like, do we really need this? They're building them everywhere. There's sort of a discomfort with all of these mosques, which I think sort of, calls to mind more modern discomforts with mosques appearing in Europe or the United States, where people aren't used to having them. And there's in Orenburg in Russia, there's one case, a really rich merchant. He's going to build a mosque right in the center of town. It takes years. And they keep coming up with reasons that to not let him do this, even though he's bought the land and he's bringing all the money, all the specialists. But and they make up all sorts of excuses, but the main excuse is we don't want these people in the middle of our town. Orenburg is on Bashkir land, right? So it's not really their town. It's a colonial town. The Bashkirs and the Tatars are the people that live there, but they've kind of kept them out of the center of the town proper.
Okay, then the Kazakh steppe is also annexed.
Yes. Well, gradually.
From the 1730 onwards.
So 1730s to the 1860s.
Okay, and then Central Asia.
1860s, 1880s.
And that brings the empire the most populous Muslim territories.
Yes.
Can you tell us a little bit about this?
So, as I said, like every Muslim community, different set of policies. So we start in the Volga, where it's this kind of suppression and then toleration. We get to the Caucasus, where we have this long drawn-out war. And one of the legacies of the Caucasus Wars is this real strong suspicion toward Islam. Because the narrative that the Russian officials begin to build around the Caucasus Wars is that what is making people in the Caucasus resist Russian rule is Islam, especially Sufism. But the new kind of post-Caucasus Wars, or near the end of the Caucasus Wars, because just as the Caucasus Wars are ending, the conflict in Central Asia will begin, is that Muslims are like a beehive. We don't want to like poke them or kick them too hard, or they'll get all fanatical and attack us and start wars. So when we get down to the Russian conquest of Central Asia, and Caucasus ends in 64, Russian conquest of Central Asia really like 65 to 68 into the 70s. Let's try not to antagonize the Muslims. So this has been called sort of the period of benevolent neglect, where Russians come in and we won't encourage Islam, but we're not going to let missionaries into these spaces because missionaries will kind of antagonize the local population.
How does it all end?
So it all ends in 1917 with the end of the Russian Empire, but really the beginning of the end comes much earlier. You have the rise of nationalism in Europe, following the French Revolution, and then picking up speed through the 19th century. That's also reaching Muslim communities. So when you get to a place like the Volga Basin, by the second half of the 19th century, you're having the beginning of discussions about a Tatar nation, as not just Muslims, but also as ethnically and nationally different, and for that reason needing to be separate in some way from Russia. And that's kind of an interesting thing, is sort of the Islam and the nation go together, is that to be Tatar is both to be, you speak Tatar, you're an ethnic Tatar, but you're also a Sunni Muslim. So that's one thing that's happening. The printing press comes in after 1905 for Muslim communities. Before 1905, it's very hard to print things in Arabic script. You have to go through Russian censors. After 1905, kind of censorship is lifted, at least that kind of censorship. There's kind of post-printing censorship, but newspapers explode. So suddenly throughout the sort of Muslim parts of Russia, people can now read newspapers in their own languages. And you get all sorts of kind of reporting about local events and also discussions about who are we? Are we one giant nation? Are we like multiple little nations that just happen to all be Muslim? And then what, once we figure that out, what do we do with it? Are we Turks? Are we Tatars and Crimeans and Kazakhs, and all those are different things? There's a whole really vibrant set of conversations that are going on. The Russian state doesn't like this because this sounds like you're all going to rebel against us or break away from the empire. So the Russian state by the 1910s really begins to crack down hard on freedom of press, freedom of religion. So there's that greater tension back and forth between Muslim communities, some of which are increasingly identifying as nations, and the Russian Empire. And, we don't know where that would have gone if the revolution hadn't happened. But then amid all of that turmoil, first in 1916, you have the Central Asian Uprising, which is short-term a result of the stresses of World War I and the recruitment of Muslim soldiers into the Russian army. What the story that goes around is that all these people are being sent so that they can go die, and then the empire can take their land away from them and give it to Russian Christians. This targets primarily the Kazakhs and then the subjects of Central Asia. Long term, it's been all these colonial problems that have been going on through the late 19th and early 20th centuries. So that blows up. We think, between at least 1 million people are involved in that, probably several million people. It's a huge uprising. It spans from what is now Kazakhstan down into what is Uzbekistan. That happens in the summer and fall of 1916. Then 1917, the revolution happens in St. Petersburg in February, or in Petrograd, as they called it then. And the different Muslim communities start stepping up, as do a lot of people, Ukrainians and Finns and Poles. And it's like, if the empire's over, that's it. We're going to go our own way. We're going to have our own states. Or maybe some of us are going to stay, but we're going to demand a new society where all religions are equal, where all ethnic groups get treated equally, where all languages are treated equally, and there's no more second-class citizenship for non-Christians. And that's kind of where it kind of short-term ends. And then you get into the Civil War, which is a whole mess. Eventually, the Bolsheviks will manage to pull a lot of these people back into what will become the kind of the Soviet Empire, kind of what they call it technically the Soviet Union. The Bolsheviks bring people back by promising, oh, yeah, we'll respect your religion. We'll respect your language. We'll respect your culture. We'll even help you build schools, build theaters, restore your madrasas, do all these things that are important to you that the Russian state wasn't letting you do because they were becoming more and more sort of Christian and Russian nationalist by the last couple decades of their rule.
And then what do they actually do?
In the 1920s, it's beginning of the 20s, there's a lot of hope that things are going to change. And there even are, and I'd like to stop and say this, there are Muslim publications and journals in the Soviet Union put out by the Soviet state in the early 1920s, where Muslims kind of write in and they debate about how the Soviet Union is going to change Islam and how this is going to be wonderful. Then by 1929, you have Stalin coming into power by the end of the 20s. You have the anti-religious campaigns. And the anti-religious campaigns target all religions. Usually when we read about it in class, we talk about Orthodox Christianity, but they target the Buddhists, they target the Jews, they target animists and shamanists and pagans of various kinds, and they target Muslims as well. So in 1929, we see the beginning of removing imams from their posts, closing down mosques. Some of them will have like the minarets sawed off and they'll be made into other kinds of buildings, whether like the nightmare scenario is that they're keeping animals in some of these former mosques, but sometimes they're used as school buildings and warehouses and other things. And they begin to initially they arrest a lot of the imams and other religious leaders, and then sort of send them back home. And then by the 1930s, there'll be a second wave of arrests, and a lot of those religious leaders are arrested and sent to the gulags, imprisoned. They're imprisoned in various prisons as well, or they are killed. They're executed. And that's there's a whole period where it becomes difficult to practice Islam, shall we say, in the Soviet Union. I mean, I wouldn't say fully like they outlaw Islam, but they restrict all of the things that you would need in order to be able to do that. So you can still sort of pray at home, but you could be reported for that. You can't get hold of like religious books or religious literature. You don't have a mosque to go pray in anymore. A lot of the holidays that you would have done, like Korbanayt, you're not doing those, which would be Eid al-Adha. You're not doing those anymore. You can't legally do them in public. One of the interesting things we understand now about Soviet Islam is once you get past that period in the 30s, you get to World War II. Are you familiar with what happens with religion in the Soviet Union during World War II?
During the
war, no. World War II. Well, it's a crisis. Right? Stalin is very worried about whether people are going to actually support the Soviet Union inside of the Soviet Union. And this is in doubt around the world. This is one reason the Germans invade. There's a lot of theories that the Soviet government is so unpopular that its own citizens will not support it. It will collapse under the least pressure. So Stalin does a whole bunch of different strategies and campaigns to get his citizens to support him. One of those is to turn to religion. So there are fatwas issued in the Soviet Union under Stalin, calling upon Muslims to come out and serve and protect the Soviet Union because that's the good Muslim thing to do. This sounds kind of crazy, but this is the new Soviet policy. The reason this is important is that because in the 30s, all of these religious institutions had been closed down, After the war, now they're kind of slowly allowed to come back. The Islam is now integrated into the Soviet state apparatus in the same way that the Orenburg Spiritual Assembly had integrated it into the Tsarist or imperial state apparatus. So now there's sort of a way by which you become an imam. There are so many imams. There are certain schools that are open that you can go to. You have to probably register with the KGB, but there's now an official structure through which religions, including Islam, will be mediated. And so Islamic practice actually kind of comes back and continues under Soviet rule, starting especially in the 1950s following the war.
Oh, I see. And so that continues till
the 1990s when the Soviet Union collapses.
Okay.
And it's really interesting in Central Asia because you'll have these sorts of moments, and in the Caucasus, where people are, this is the head of the kolkhoz, right? He's a good Soviet bureaucrat. And then he dies, and you have to have a good Muslim funeral for him, right? And even in some areas, build a proper mausoleum for him. So all sorts of ways that they're kind of working the state to get hold of the materials and the permission they need to carry out these different kinds of what they would identify as local Islamic rituals. And this becomes part of Soviet culture if you live in Central Asia, if you live in the Caucasus. If you live in, it's a little bit less in the Volga, but you have some of this in the Volga as well. I've written on the manuscript culture in the Volga region. People are in Tatarstan and Bashkortostan copying down Muslim manuscripts and then passing them on. Also creating little textbooks to teach people how to read in the older versions of the Turkic language, because the Soviets really transformed the language in the 20s and 30s. Also teaching people how to read in Arabic in the 40s, 50s, 60s, so that they can continue to practice Islam. So all of that, kind of underground schools that go on teaching people to read. So all of that's going on in the Soviet period. So officially, there is no Islam in the Soviet Union. Unofficially, there's a lot of Islam going on in the Soviet Union.
How did you become interested in this subject?
As an undergraduate, I really wanted to travel somewhere in the Islamic world to study abroad. And at the time, my mom was just like, no, you're not going to Israel, Palestine. So I'm like, okay, or Egypt. So all these things off the list. Also, I didn't have any money. So I would, went talk to my advisor. She says, well, there's this grant you can get from the government, but you have to study a less commonly taught language. And there's two we offer here, Macedonian or Tatar. And I'm like, I don't really want to go to Macedonia. I have no idea what Tatar is, but I'll give that a try. So I started taking Tatar. I fell in love with the language, but also the literature and the poetry. A lot of my work now focuses still on poetry and literature. And I just followed it from there. I took another year of it. Then I went to Kazan, and I just kind of kept following that thread, and eventually went to grad school and started writing about more things than just poetry, obviously, at the end. But that's how I got involved in it.
A final comment is, so I'm delighted that we had you come and talk about Islam and Russia, but I'm also delighted because you are a woman. And I've discovered how much of a challenge through this series it's been to have women come and speak. But over the course of turning my season 2 ideas into reality and actually having these episodes happen, I had women back out. I had women become sick. I had women's family members become sick. I had women changing locations, or I had women simply just not responding to me. Is that a case of bad luck?
I think a lot of it is women just have more to deal with. And I can only speak coming from the academic worlds, but if you're a woman, it often seems like you have your academic work, and then you have everything else, your family, your home, and all those things pulling at you. Whereas a lot of my male colleagues, it feels like their work is the thing that they do, and they can come home and rely on somebody else to manage a lot of the other life issues that emerge outside of that.
Danielle Ross, thank you so much for participating in Muslim Footprints.
Thank you for having me.
Muslim Footprints is developed and produced by Kalima Communications in partnership with the Ismaili, the online platform for the global Ismaili community. This episode was filmed in Provo, Utah by Tanner Sisson, Nick Fry and Mehdi Lalani, with special thanks to Brigham Young University Broadcasting for the studio. Here's the team at the Ismaili who helped put it together. Amira Jiwani is the series producer. Azim Lakhani is the editor, with assistance from Suraya Mirali for subtitling. Rasul Daya and Alim Karmali have reviewed content and helped with promotion on the Ismaili website. Aziza Jan Mahmood is our social media strategist, who is managing the Muslim Footprint's social media accounts. And Alia Muhammad is supporting with promoting the series. Shahid Karim, who oversees the team at the Ismaili, is executive producer for the show, along with me. We're grateful to our external reviewers, who are all members of the board of the Institute of Ismaili Studies. These include Shainul Jiwa, Associate Professor and a Specialist in Fatimid Studies, Orkan Mir Kasimov, Associate Professor and a Specialist in Islamic History, Dr. Hakim El-Nazarov, Head of the Central Asian Studies Unit, Dr. Dagikudo Dagiev, Senior Research Associate and a Specialist in Central Asian Studies, and William Rees Hoffman, Research Associate in the South Asian Studies Unit and an ethnomusicologist. Additional reviews were also provided by Shiraz Alibai, Deputy Director at the Aga Khan Trust for Culture. And thank you all for watching. Be sure to follow our social media pages where you can find additional content and keep up to date with our news. My name is Aisha Daya and you've been watching Muslim Footprints.